So chapter 21 is all about scatter control. So what we're going to do today, again, is we're going to kind of, we'll look at the overview and we'll look at the terminology, and then we'll kind of do a review of the difference between sharpness, recorded detail, visibility functions, and more specifically what it is that is going to create more scatter radiation in technique and tissue type and tissue volume that we might irradiate. So that's what this is going to be about. When we're going to have this test, I don't know. So probably a couple of weeks. So in overview, what we're going to look at in this section is technical factors effect on radiation. We're going to look at KVP, we're going to look at mass, we're also going to look at the function of things like voltage waveform and those type things, filtration and all those things. So we'll look at the beam restrictors and their effect on scatter radiation, and that's one of the reasons that I'm going to really kind of hammer home collimation is for two different reasons. One is that it's a visibility function, and two, it's a radiation exposure function. The less tissue you irradiate, the less scatter you get, less exposure the patient gets. So we'll talk about the patient factors, and those patient factors are going to be, the type of tissue, the volume of tissue, the thickness of tissue, and going back to beam restriction, the volume laterally as well. So it's not just the depth of the tissue, but how much tissue we irradiate overall. And then we'll talk about post-patient scatter removal and the implications of that on both patient care, patient dose, and also our technique. So we'll talk about the primary beam versus the remnant beam. We'll talk about the type of interactions. We'll retouch on that and the technical factors, effects on those interactions. Again, we'll compare, and we just came through this, sharpness, recorded detail with visibility. We'll look at the methods of scatter control, and it's really just two. It's either we're going to prevent scatter from being created to some degree. Scatter's going to be created, but we can limit how much scatter we create. And the other is cleaning up the scatter after it's created. So we'll look at the after creation in context of grid use and air gap, and when and how much of a technique change we need for each one of those, when to introduce a grid. Air gap is kind of sort of set, but when to introduce a grid. We'll talk about grid ratios and the effectiveness of grids, when to use high ratio grids, when to use low ratio grids. We'll talk about the radiation dose implications of each one of those. We'll talk about the different types of grids. There's a multitude of types of grids, and we'll talk about the complications of positioning of those grids as well. So basic terminology, contrast, by now the contrast is a function of really the lookup table, as is the density. There are things that we can do to affect those things, but for the most part, your contrast is going to be set by your computer, right? And the lookup table applied to your computer algorithm, the algorithm applied to your histogram is what gives us our contrast. So contrast resolution, grayscale, opposite of contrast, we just came through all that, latitude, how it ties into all that. Primary beam is the beam before it hits the patient, and then the remnant beam is what comes through the patient. The remnant beam is it consists of your image making x-rays. So primary beam, some things about the primary beam. We're going to talk about off-focus radiation, what it is in the primary beam versus secondary beam, because the remnant beam sometimes is referred to as secondary beam. We're going to talk about field size, as increases and decreases, and field size and collimation are really the same thing, but the terminology kind of seems to be opposite of each other. So we'll talk about field size and collimation, how we look at those. We'll talk about positive beam limitation, which is probably still on the registry, even though you don't see it on the equipment all that much anymore, but we'll talk about the historical context of what positive beam limitation was. Again, we'll talk about the grids in context of grid types, grid ratio, grid frequency, the cleanup, which types of grids have the best cleanup. We'll talk about the contrast improvement factor, which again, you know, is really the main thing that controls our contrast is going to be a computer algorithm, but it's still contrast improvement factor is a testable thing. Bucky factor has to do with your technical factor change because you've used either beam restriction or introduced a grid. Specifically, the Bucky factor applies to the grid. We'll talk about types of grid cutoff and what causes them, and some of those are going to be specific to different types of grids. So some grids are going to show grid cutoff in ways that others will not. We'll talk about patient dose again, and again, air gap technique. So remnant beam, the remnant beam, that is your image making beam. That's constitutes 1% or less of the primary beam before it strikes the patient, strikes the image receptor. We'll talk about noise primarily in this section in context of scatter. Scatter radiation beam limiting devices. Collimators are not the only type of beam limiting device. It's probably the only ones that you use. And again, the grids are in there multiple times. So just a review of the interactions, and we'll bring this up and we'll talk about you know, interactions and the BRIM spectrum here in just a minute. So a review of interactions, primarily what we see on the image receptor is either lack of photons striking the image receptor, which they don't strike the image receptor because they underwent photoelectric absorption inside of the patient. They give us those light areas, but the two ways that they actually interact on the image receptor or the two types of photons that interact on the image receptor would be scatter radiation or penetration. Right? So the ways that we create X-ray, of course, we've got your BRIMs and we've got characteristic. And the difference between those two is that the BRIMs, how do we create BRIMs? Where do they come from?
The electrons hitting the anode?
Okay, well, all of them, electrons are hitting the anode.
Right,
But specifically in the anode, in the tungsten atom, what does the word BRIMs mean? Breaking, right. So what breaking radiation is the projectile electron gets close to the nucleus of the atom, and we use Jupiter as an example. If you remember, you know, comet or whatever comes through the solar system, and sometimes Jupiter will gobble it up because it's got a pretty good gravitational field. It's very big. So the electron comes through the nucleus, or not through the nucleus, but close to the nucleus of the atom, changes directions, loses some energy, and we get a BRIMS photon creation that's equal to the difference between the incoming energy and the outgoing energy. And we've used, you know, all kinds of examples of that. If our incoming energy is 100 kVp, that's our electron, let's say KeV, and the outgoing is 50, then the X-ray photon is created. Is the difference between those, difference being subtraction. So our X-ray photon would be 50, right, exactly. So the characteristic is where we have interaction with the electron and the electron. We get ejection from inner shell, and we get a replacement electron. And again, the energy of the X-ray photon that's created is going to be the difference between the binding energies of those two electrons. So if we get injection of an inner shell electron and a replacement with a free-floating electron, then we get a maximum energy, which is characteristic maximum kVp of 69, right, 69 kVp. So our characteristic is the only one that we recognize, even though we get characteristic photons off of any electron that we hit. All right, the only one that we're going to pay any attention to at all is that inner shell electron being replaced by an unbound electron, 69.5 kV. So, factors that affect the emission spectrum, this is where we're gonna spend most of the rest of the day. So, looking at the BREM spectrum, again, the BREM spectrum is the emissions spectrum. The most significant portion of the emission spectrum is going to be your BREMs. Only 15% are characteristics, of the rest are gonna be BREM. So we're gonna talk about mass, KVP, filtration, target material, voltage waveform. So I'm gonna mute this, and raise that up, and we're gonna run through that one more time. Roll that one back up. There's something in there. Alright, so our distribution spectrum, I want to draw it as it, comes off of the target. So what we get is number of X-ray photons and the energy of those photons, and there's G in there. I put the G in, but I put it like after the N. Energy. Alright, so at the target, what we get, most of the X-rays that we create are going to be very low energy, right? So what we get is a distribution spectrum inside of the X-ray tube that looks kind of like that. We get a tremendous number of low energy photons that would do us no good at all. Now, if you remember, in order to legally create an X-ray and expose human tissue with it, we have to have filtration to get rid of some of these, because these are just going to absorb inside of the patient and drive patient dose, right? So we got to get rid of them. And we'll get rid of them how? Filtration, right. So some of the filtration is going to be inherent. It's stuff that's in the imaging system already, and we can't do anything to remove it, right? So we use a vacuum tube, so something has to hold that vacuum in, and that's what we refer to as the envelope. That's your X-ray tube, right? You don't see the X-ray tube. X-ray tube is inside the housing, so don't confuse the X-ray tube with the housing. Two totally different things. Protective housing, X-ray tube. So the X-ray tube might be glass envelope, might be a metal envelope. It's going to absorb something. So just trying to get out of the X-ray tube means that we're going to lose some of these low energy X-ray photons. We're still going to have a tremendous number of low energy X-ray photons. We'll put this at 50 kVp, just to pick a number. So we still have a tremendous amount of low energy photons just going to absorb inside of the patient. So the next thing that it's going to go through is inside the protective housing, we've got to keep the X-ray tube cool. It's not going to be cool, but we want to cool it down, right? Otherwise, we'll burn it out, because the main thing that ends tube life is heat, for a lot of different reasons, be it melted bearings or open filament because you've melted the filament and it just broke, cracked anode, whatever. It's all about heat, right? So oil, okay, so it's kind of a little bit depressing, but oil, what is oil? Basically liquid fat, right? So what are we? We're basically solid fat, right? So we're solidified, but it's kind of the same thing. So if you absorb X-rays, and if you did not absorb X-rays, then none of this would matter, right? But you absorb X-rays, so that oil also absorbs X-rays. So it's going to get rid of some more of it. It's not a whole lot of oil, but there's some in there. So what's the next thing? It's got to get out of the tube housing. So all of that happened before it even came out of the tube housing. Something has to hold that oil in place, right? And that's what we refer to as the port. I also put a couple of videos of the Biomed guy from ETMC, now UT. It was ETMC at the time. A Biomed guy took the collimator housing off and he made some exposures. And when he made the exposures, you could actually see the electrons jump from cathode to anode. It just looked like a flash, right? So your patient sometimes said, they'll say, I know the x-ray took because I saw the flash, and they can't see the flash. There's too much stuff in the way. All right, so it's gotta go through something to get out of the housing. So that port is also gonna remove some of those low energy x-ray photons. And it looks something like that. And then, the next thing that it goes to, or through, is the mirror that you use to determine your field size, right? So what's on the backside of a mirror?
Cardboard.
What's that?
I would say cardboard.
Cardboard, yeah, okay, yeah, but the thing that makes it reflect is typically silver. So silver is a metal, you take an x-ray with somebody who had a zipper,
Yeah, it's just
yeah, shows up real well, doesn't it? So it absorbs some x-rays. It's thin silver, so it's not as significant as zipper, but it's gonna absorb some x-rays too, which is gonna make our brim spectrum look something like that. So filtration does a number of things. And that is, let me kind of draw a dotted line back up here. This is all that we absorb through all that type of filtration. Each one of those are inherent filtration. If we put anything else in there, it's added filtration. That's inherent filtration. All that took care of that. So if I were to take and average the energies of all these x-ray photons added to all these x-ray photons over here, then what we would have is a very low average, right? But by eliminating the lower energy x-ray photons, our average increases. Remember I use the analogy, if I throw out your lowest test score, what happens to your overall average? It increases, right. So what filtration does is it increases the average, it decreases the number, and it pushes the height of the bubble towards the high energy side, which is why it increases the average. Okay, so that's filtration. If I add any more filtration, it's gonna continue to bring those numbers down and increase the average. All right, so there's filtration. Now let's get into the more significant things. With KVP, let's say I had to scale this down a little bit because, you know, maybe this chart would have gone up further and we're still at 50 KVP. So we're gonna skip all that stuff and just draw our brim spectrum with the filtration. So filtration is what determines where that is gonna be. Determines what our minimum energy is going to be, right? So KVP doesn't have any effect on that. If we were to increase our KVP, let's say now to 100 KVP, then our brim spectrum looks like that. Minimum energy doesn't change. The area under the bubble, I'll dot that line. The area under the bubble increased, and that's just all numbers. A couple of y'all missed the question on KVP about the emission and whether or not increases in KVP increase the emission from the X-ray tube, and they do, right? A lot. It's the most significant technical factor that we have is KVP. KVP increases the peak energy, increases the numbers, pushes the average, which is the peak of the bubble, towards the high energy side. We get more of everything with the sole exception of minimum energy, right? Still controlled by filtration. So increases in KVP increase average, increase number, increase peak energy, and it determines whether or not we have a characteristic spectrum with 69.5 KVP, right? So it does everything except for what filtration does. And there's a direct but sometimes exponential relationship. So increases in KVP increase all that stuff, but it's a 15% increase in KVP gives us how much of a change at the image receptor? A double at the image receptor. Output from the X-ray tube is not going to be double. At the image receptor, it's going to be double. Okay? So then we've got, let's see, we've got machine phase. So remember the lollipop is machine phase. So if we have single phase, then again, at the anode, we've got something that looks like this.
and we've got filtration that's gonna bring it down to something like, more like that. Okay. Now, if we add three-phase, we'll say that's single phase. If we add three-phase, is it gonna change our peak energy? We're going back to 50 kVp now. Is it gonna change our peak energy? Answer is no. 50 kVp is 50 kVp, right? 50 kVp is the speed with which we send the electrons across the tube. The maximum energy that we're gonna get is 50 kVp, regardless of if we're using single phase, three phase, whatever, 50 kVp is 50 kVp. Now, if we go with three phase, then let's do this, our minimum energy remains the same. What we get though is a higher average. It gets down to the peak energy. We have the same peak energy, we have the same minimum energy, but what we have is an increase in numbers and it pushes towards the high energy side. Alright? Everybody with me? So what's number 4? I'm missing one. Benadryl head.
You said it does change the average, but it doesn't change the peak?
Does not change the peak, does change the average, pushes it towards the high energy side. Oh, mass. Yeah, mass. Mass. So we're still at 50 kVp. 50 kVp. So as we change our mass, what we get is kind of, I'm not even going to complicate that. What we get with a change in mass is our Brim spectrum. We get the same minimum energy, we get the same maximum energy, and the only thing that we're gonna get, I didn't draw that just quite right, the only thing that we're gonna get then is no change in peak, no change in average, no change in minimum, but what we get is an increase in numbers. So mass is mass, we just get an increase in numbers. So where we have a relationship in output with filtration, the average goes up, the numbers go down. When we introduce single phase, three phase, then when we go from single phase to three phase, we get an increase in numbers, increase in average, pushes towards a high energy side. With KVP, average goes up, numbers go up, peak goes up. With mass, we get just an increase in numbers, exponential direct. We change from 50 kVp to 100 kVp, and let's do it that way. Let's do it that way, because that just didn't work. So we change from 50 kVp at, let's say, 10 mass to 50 kVp at, I don't know, 20 mass. Then what we're going to get is the same average, the same amount, but we're going to get an increase in numbers. That's the only thing that we get.
How can you increase the numbers without changing the average?
Well, we didn't have any kind of filtration. We didn't increase the peak energy. The only thing that we added is with mass, the only thing that changes is the height of the bubble. So I didn't draw that completely. I mean, it's kind of hard to completely parallel, but what we get then is, I guess, how I should have drawn that is more like that. So that our average remained the same, right? It was here, so our average remains the same. Yeah.
How does changing from a single phase to three phase change your average then?
Good question. All right, so when we have single phase, what we get is a voltage waveform that goes from peak energy to minimum energy, and it stops, okay? So the average between that peak and the minimum energy is, set at whatever, if we went with 50 kVp, maybe that average would be 25, okay? It's not, but let's say it is. So once we go to three-phase, it never drops to zero. Okay, the overall beam energy, each pulse does, but the overall beam energy does not. So we've got those overlapping pulses, so then our average energy may increase to 35 maybe. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So we eliminated all of our zeros.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So, any other questions before we go? So this is emission from the X-ray tube. Okay. And here's kind of the point to all this, is that anything that increases the average or increases the peak energy increases the likelihood that the photon that we create and send into the patient's body will exit the patient's body. Okay, so, well, what about filtration? We're going to lose numbers. Yeah, we're going to lose numbers, but the numbers that we have are more likely to penetrate through the patient. Okay, if we increase KVP, we're going to increase penetration through the patient. We increase our, from single phase, three phase, our average goes up. We're going to increase the likelihood that any photon that we send into the patient is going to exit the patient. When we increase mass, that's not true. We don't change the PE ratio with mass. The only thing that changes with mass is patient dose and then exposure to the image receptor. So there's no change in PE ratio. These other three do, okay? So if we increase our filtration, generally once we introduce filtration or increase filtration, we're gonna have to increase our mass to compensate for the photons we lost. So we're gonna increase our mass, in which case we're gonna get more photons through the patient, striking the image receptor. Considering the different types of interactions inside of the patient, how many transmit proportionally through the patient without interaction? Just in a word, a lot or a little? Not many. So how many transmit through the patient scattered compared to PE? A lot more, right? Right. So anything that increases that energy is going to increase that scatter, okay, proportionally. So we add filtration, adjust our mass, and what we're going to get is more scatter radiation to the image receptor. We increase KVP, we get more penetration, we get more scatter to the image receptor. We change from single phase, three phase, and then three phase to high frequency, we increase the average energy and the numbers, and we get more scatter radiation to the image receptor. So all three of these change the PE ratio, okay? And increase the likelihood that we're going to have more scatter radiation at the image receptor, okay? So everybody good with all this? Okay, then now, this is kind of an overview of beam restriction and how beam restriction can help you to not create scatter. Okay, so primarily what we have is our technical factors, we have our patient conditions. Those two married together give us our scatter radiation, our likelihood of having scatter. Okay, so bend your mind into a complete hypothetical that you're never ever going to see in practice, okay? So let's say we could cut human tissue down to a thinness of one water molecule, okay? Everybody with me so far? So you've got this fine sheet of human tissue. You've got your different interactions, right? You got your penetration, you got your scatter, Thompson scatter, classical scatter, and we got photoelectric, right? So in this scenario, we're going to not make it a line, but we're going to make it individual water molecules because primarily we're water. So you got nuclei and you've got electrons. So the nuclei are not going to be smashed together so much as they're going to be at a little bit of a distance from each other, right? So you make an exposure on this extremely thin piece of material. Are you going to have those three interactions? You're going to have photoelectric, Thompson, Compton, and, penetration. Can something get through there?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna have penetration's pretty easy at this point, right? Didn't touch anything. Might we have some that hit those and bounce off in different directions, either wide angle scatter or, shallow angle scatter? We've got both types of scatter there. Thompson, Compton. Might those happen? Yeah. If we're using low enough KVP, might we have some photoelectric? Yeah. Okay. So now let's say we take another cut and it's 2 atoms thick, 2 water molecules thick. Do you think that if you cut that off of a person, that these atoms are going to be perfectly in line with each other? No. Okay, so let's just kind of, in this scenario, we're going to spackle in these gaps. If you don't know what spackle is, it's what you plug holes in wall with whenever you take a picture down. So we're going to put these here. So some of them are a little more in line than others. Okay, so again, we're going to send x-rays through that. What is the likelihood that we're going to have Compton, Thompson, and photoelectric now that we've added a second layer?
Higher.
It's going to be higher, right? So I can continue to do this, but you got it, right? The more layers I add, the more likely we're going to have each one of those. And on a 1-for-1 basis, we've got, scatter radiation, fair amount of scatter radiation. We're going to have photoelectric, and we're still going to have a decreasing amount of penetration that interacts with nothing. Okay? So the thickness of the tissue, and we went through that in the last section, the thickness of the tissue is going to greatly affect your PE ratio. So if you've got a very thin anatomy, say fingers, how much scatter do you create? In a word? Not much, right? But you take an x-ray of somebody's abdomen, now how much? A lot. Primarily scatter radiation is what's going to be coming through the patient, right? So thickness of the tissue creates more scatter radiation. We've got to deal with that, right? So once we get up to about the knee size, 10 centimeters, shoulder size, 10 centimeters, and above, we're going to be creating so much scatter radiation that we really need to do something with it. What's that? Did you say grid?
Yeah.
Yes, grid. We're going to use grid. Also, because higher KVP is more likely to penetrate through more of those tissues, the further it penetrates into the tissue, the more likely it is to undergo one of the scatter events, right? And less likely it is to penetrate through without any kind of interaction. It will, some will, but the more likely you are to create scatter. So higher KVP, more scatter radiation. Once we get to 70 KVP, we need a grid, right? All right, so we'll get to grids. What I want to focus on right now is really beam restriction, okay? So we create an x-ray beam. We create an x-ray beam, and we want to cover this whole tissue. So we've got this greatly diverging x-ray beam, and just forgetting all about, sharpness for recorded detail, forgetting about divergent central ray and parallax and all that kind of stuff. All these interactions are going to occur all the way across all those tissues, right? Every one of these molecules has, the potential for each one of those interactions, primarily scatter radiation if we're doing, soft tissue, water-based tissue, all right? So how much, again, just in a word, how much scatter radiation are we going to create exposing all of those tissues? A lot, right? Now, if we change our collimation and we don't expose all of the tissues, we only expose, we only expose this much. In a word, what's the comparison between this one and this one? How much radiation, scatter radiation we're going to create here?
A lot less.
A lot less, right? okay? So, the moral of this whole exercise is the thicker the tissue, the more or less scatter you're gonna create. More. The greater your collimation, more collimation means a smaller beam, right? So the more collimation you have, you're gonna have less, right? So when we're talking about exposing volume of tissue, we're talking about two things. It could be the thickness of the tissue, you know, because you got to get it all the way through the patient's to get to the image receptor and make an X-ray, or it could be the exposure due to collimation or lack thereof. Question or stretching? Okay, all right. You know, when you're stretching one side of it, it's kind of hard to tell. All right, so you okay with this? Yeah.
So, on an abdomen X-ray, is collimating maybe more important because the divergence is greater on a wider shot like that?
Okay, so that's a good question, and it's a complicated answer.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
I
so
take it back.
let's-
I take it back.
Well, let's park on it for just a minute. What do you need to see on a KUP?
Kidneys, ureters,
Ovarian.
Kidneys, ureters, and bladder. So where are the kidneys?
up top.
Kind of peripheral, right? The ureters you just don't see unless you got contrast in them. Where's the bladder?
Down.
It's way down. So what should your field size be in order to see all that?
Big.
You gotta expose the whole abdomen. Now, let's apply that to L-spine, okay? What's that?
You collimate way down.
Yeah, you can collimate way down just to get the L-spine. Now, this is why I say it's complicated. You know, I'm gonna talk about collimation in context that it's your professional responsibility to collimate, okay? It's radiation exposure. The more tissue you expose, the more radiation you're given to the patient, okay? There are times, though, that you get an order for an exam, and it's a specific exam, like an L-spine, where you would think, we need to see the L-spine, so I want to collimate down to the L-spine. And some doctors are gonna say, I don't want you to collimate for your L-spine, shoot it like a KUB. Most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, I would say you need collimate. But there are certain exam types that I would say they've got a legitimate reason for keeping that open. Okay, so why might we shoot a L-spine? Back pain, right. So,
Post-surgery.
what's that?
Post-surgery.
Okay, post-op. And post-op, you probably would be more likely to want to collimate, right? But what if a patient comes into the ER and they say, I got back pain. I got pain right here. On my right side,
Kidney.
could be kidney stone. You collimate just down to the L-spine, and what do you not get? Kidney. All right, so you might miss kidney stone. Gallbladder's over there too, right? So gallbladders or gallstones don't show up as well on X-rays as kidney stones do, which don't show up well on X-rays, but some do. Okay, so if you collimate just down to the L-spine, then you might miss a gallstone, a kidney stone, or something else that might be causing that back pain. So in those cases, I would agree. I made the mistake of getting on Facebook.
Oh boy.
So, yeah, well, for a lot of reasons. But specifically, I got onto some radiology specific pages, and it's depressing, some of the images I see. You know, what do you think about my odontoid process? And their collimated field goes from thyroid to the eyes for odontoid. For an odontoid that's that big, surrounded by a bone that's that big, collimate to the mouth, There's no reason to expose a person's eyes and thyroid for odontoid process. So in those cases, absolutely collimate down tight. But if your radiologist has a policy that on your KUB, don't collimate, then don't collimate. AP of the T-spine, kind of the same thing. What's causing the back pain? if we just shoot a AP and lateral of the T-spine, the patient's got a pneumonia that's giving them back pain, might completely miss it. So there are legitimate reasons not to collimate on certain exam types, but I'd say 9 out of 10 of those collimate as tightly as you can without clipping the anatomy. So back to our odontoid, I mean, they went from ear to ear, eyes to thyroid. Saw another one that was a Towns. I thought, wow, great, somebody's actually shooting skull work. And the collimated field, I kid you not, was 3 inches on either side of the head. You're x-raying air, you know? It just makes no sense at all. So, volume, again, is going to create or scatter. Anything that increases the peak energy, anything that increases the average energy, increases the likelihood of scatter radiation striking the image receptor. So that's where we're going to be, is talking about techniques to limit scatter radiation, and then equipment to limit the scatter radiation either being created or striking the image receptor. Okay. Primarily where we're going to be parked is beam restriction and grids. So grids gets kind of, gets a little bit hairy, and there is some math associated with grids and the different types of grids and which ones give you more cleanup. So let me make sure that I check all these boxes. And what is our time? I'm already at 41 minutes. So let me drive this one back down. Oop. So the factors affecting the emission spectrum, mass, only numbers. The only thing that it does is numbers. Okay, so if you double your mass, you double everything. You double everything in context of radiation exposure to the image receptor. KVP changes everything, and it changes everything except for the minimum energy. It affects, if we see a characteristic curve, it increases the height of the bubble, increases the numbers, and pushes everything towards the high energy side. So filtration has no change in peak, it just changes the numbers, it changes the average and pushes it towards the high energy side. If we add filtration, if we have a perfect technique and we add filtration, we're gonna have to increase something to compensate for those X-ray photons we lost. So with the filtration, if it already pushes everything towards the high energy side, increases the likelihood that we're gonna have scatter radiation at the image receptor, what technical factor do you think that we would change if we had filtration? KVP or mass? Mass. Because it's already pushing it towards the high energy side and increasing the likelihood that we're going to get scatter radiation to the image receptor, right? So if we increase KVP, we also increase the average, which increases the chances we're going to have more scatter radiation to the image receptor. It compounds the issue. We have scatter on scatter, okay? One thing we didn't talk about is target material. If you remember back to whichever chapter this was in, target material changes everything. You're never going to change target material. The only time that you're going to see a change in target material is if you happen to cross-train into mammography. They use totally different targets. So in diagnostic radiology, it doesn't do anything. If we shot a hand on a mammo machine, it would be a totally different set of techniques. And then voltage waveform, no change in peak, no change in minimum. It does change the average and it changes the numbers. If we go from a single phase to a 3-phase, then our output is roughly how much? 2. Very good, very good. I just knew somebody was going to pop out with 3, which would be logical. But this is X-ray. All right. So factor of 2. So we'll go from 3-phase to single phase, then we have to divide our technique by 2. All right. So we're going to end with the effects of the factors on the image. And when we change our mass, then when we're talking about density, we're really talking about exposure.
It does change it directly, so if we increase our mass, we increase our patient exposure, we increase our image receptor exposure. It doesn't really have any effect on density, or contrast really, except for all the way out in the extreme. So if you way overexpose a patient to the point that you flooded your individual image receptors in your overall image receptor, then everything comes out so dark you can't make any differentiation between things. Or if your mass is so low, it becomes kind of gray and you can't really see anything. So within a reasonable diagnostic range, there is no effect of mass on your on the density or the contrast on the image. Same thing with KVP. Again, play with this in clinicals and try to prove it out. Sometimes you can make it look like it is totally not true, and sometimes you can make it look like it is true. So the effects of filtration are going to be on exposure. It's going to be inverse. It's going to have minimal effect on contrast or density. Again, because your computer algorithm is going to take care of that. Now, if you added filtration that limited the number of x-rays coming out of the collimator housing significantly, like if you added, 4 millimeters of filtration, that could have an effect on your image. So again, that though is a lack of photon striking the image receptor. Voltage waveform, again, there's just not a whole lot that you're going to visualize on your image because it's all about the computer algorithm, your lookup table. So as voltage waveform increases from single phase, three phase to high frequency, we get a greater output, but the result on the image is not that significant. SID is exponentially inverse, so if we double our SID, we go from 40 to 80 inches, then what would be our change at the image receptor if we use the same technique? It's 4, yeah, it's the inverse square law, it's 4. So direct square law gives us our technique change. It'd be the same thing, just in the opposite direction. We would quadruple our mass. Okay? Y'all good?
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Yep.
I'm confused again about the KVP and the patient IR. Does it increase in the patient and decrease as IR, or decrease as IR and increase in the patient?
Okay. Again, KVP is so complicated. So it depends. It depends. If you just increase your KVP, your patient dose is going to go up. Let's say we use 15% increase. Your patient dose may go up by, let's pick a number, 30%. Patient dose increases just because you increase your KVP. Image receptor exposure is going to double. Okay, and that's because as we increase KVP, we increase the likelihood that we're going to get penetration. Right?
So it would decrease at the IR, right? There would be more scatter in the patient, but less on the IR?
No, there'd be more on the IR. If we just increase KVP, we're gonna increase. Yeah,
Everything.
yeah, we're gonna increase everything.
Okay.
So high KVP in context of scatter is bad.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if we increase our KVP and we decrease our mass, we increase our KVP by 15% and we decrease our mass by a factor of 2. Patient dose goes down and image receptor exposure remains the same, but we're gonna have a higher percentage of scatter because of the higher KVP. We're gonna have a higher percentage of scatter at the image receptor. So in context of scatter radiation, think high KVP bad. Okay? And it used to have a really strong effect on the appearance of the image. That was what we used to control the contrast, but the computer algorithm kind of evens that out, and it doesn't have that same effect anymore. So again, for that reason, I'm going to continue to say we really should be starting to use higher KVPs. We really ought to be past this low KVP thing by now.
On the retest, is it gonna, for the registry, is it gonna say what controls contrast? What's it think?
That's a good question. I got to go back and look at the test. I don't think that. I think. Okay, so let me shorten this. what controls your contrast is going to be not your KVP, but your lookup table.
Yes.
Okay,
So is that gonna be on the registry?
yeah, yeah, the KVP, if, I'll need to look into the Canvas module, but, the ART has this grid of exposure factors and what they control. It's just this little box, and, I think after the last update, they don't even list KVP as having an effect on contrast anymore. Yeah, it doesn't really have an effect on contrast. Yeah. Okay? Y'all have a good weekend. It's supposed to rain a lot, I think. So.